You are listening to the Muslim Mind Collaborative podcast,
Understanding Mental Health Services and Experiences of Muslim Communities in the UK.
Welcome to the Muslim Mind Collaborative podcast, where we'll be speaking to practitioners, academics, and those with lived experiences for our episode on understanding mental health in South Asian communities. I'm Sabah Gilani, the Director of the Muslim Mind Collaborative and Chief Exec of the Better Community Business Network, your host for this episode. We're joined by esteemed guests, Dr. Ghazala Mir, an Associate Professor at Leeds University with research interests in health and social inequalities. Her research covers disadvantaged, ethnic and faith communities, women and people with learning disabilities. And Dr. Tina Mistry, who is a trained psychologist with over 15 years of experience working across a variety of sectors, including the NHS, education, charities, and the corporate sector. She recently founded the Brown Therapist Network, offering coaching and facilitating peer learning to a global community of South Asian therapists. Her training in mental health awareness explores intersectionality and systems of oppression. Dr. Tina also hosts her own podcast, Brownology, Deconstructing and Decolonizing South Asian Mental Health. And finally, Umrah Hayat, who is a mental health and community activist. She has experience of working in the third sector, providing confidential, faith-sensitive mental health and wellbeing advice through a community helpline service. So welcome, everybody. Just to set some context on South Asian Awareness Month, I wanted to share with you a few stats. So Asian and Asian British people represent more than 50% of the ethnic minority population in the UK, and their health and wellbeing is of increasing concern. Research by the UK government recently revealed nearly 2/3 of people of South Asian origin in England experiencing mental health problems as a result of COVID pandemic. So Dr. Ghazala, I've had the privilege of obviously working with you for our Hidden Survivors report, which looks at mental health and well-being of young Muslims across the UK and how faith plays a role of resilience and recovery. And you talked about the need for culture as well as faith-sensitive approaches to understanding mental health. Can you perhaps tell us more about your research and understanding of South Asian communities and their recognition and experience of mental health issues, as well as some of the challenges and barriers that minority communities face?
Yeah, of course. Yeah, thank you. So the research that we did at Leeds involved working with the primary care mental health services to look at the way that they were delivering services and how we might better develop an intervention that would meet the needs of people from Muslim backgrounds with depression more effectively. And there's a lot of evidence to show that culturally tailored approaches actually can be more effective, or at least as effective, and perhaps reach out to a wider range of people from cultural minorities than are currently being reached. So what we did as part of the research was to speak to people who are working with Muslim communities, people who had experience of the kind of issues that we were looking at, and people who were using services from Muslim backgrounds to try and work out, what a culturally tailored approach would actually look like. Because we get a lot of guidance saying, approaches to be culturally tailored, but actually, what does that mean in practice? How do we actually interpret that? And there's so many different interpretations of what that means. So we developed best practice through speaking to people in the field and through speaking to people, who are using services. And we manualized the approach that we sort of put together so that people could deliver this in practice. And one of the key issues was really looking at faith as a resource for health, religion as a resource for health, that people often turn to their faith when they're in poor health as a way of recovery or as a way of addressing anxieties and low mood and depression. But that's often ignored within mainstream services. So the approach that we developed and manualized was then piloted in Bradford. Now we're running a full trial in Bradford to see, the effect that's having, how much impact it's having. We've already completed a trial in Pakistan, in Lahore, and we found that actually the approach, it was compared to CBT, which is also an evidence-based approach. This manualized approach that we developed is based on behavioral activation, which is similar to CBT in terms of its effectiveness. And what we found was that people engage more for longer with the culturally tailored approach. And because of that, they do better. Their depression scores in Pakistan were better. So we're waiting to see, that's in a setting where there's a majority of people from Muslim backgrounds. In minority, where the population is a minority, often the results can be different. So we're waiting to see the results from Bradford. And we've also done a feasibility trial in Turkey to show that, this is a much needed approach. People actually need something like this. Therapists and practitioners and people using services are all asking for something, that is culturally tailored for Muslim communities.
Sure. And Dr. Ghazala, what barriers do you feel that there are that people from South Asian community and Muslim communities face in accessing appropriate help?
So often what's on offer isn't really appropriate for what people need. The fact that faith identity is ignored, for example, or practitioners don't feel equipped or trained to engage with it means that there's a whole wide spectrum of how that is addressed. So it goes from people think it's unprofessional to actually talk about religion in a clinical setting, right to the other end of the spectrum where people feel actually it's really important to address that, and you have to make space. Often what happens is that clients will take the lead from professionals about what they can and can't discuss. And you need quite a lot of confidence to be able to initiate a discussion about faith if your practitioner you're seeing isn't mentioning it at all. So that's a huge challenge. Racism is another challenge. Islamophobia is another challenge. We see that, the NHS is actually a reflection of the, society in general in the UK, for example. So it would be very surprising if we didn't find racism within the NHS. And we know it's all, we all know that it is there. So clients can often fear the racism that they might feel. They might fear being stereotyped or misrepresented. That can actually stop them from even addressing, even trying to engage, or if they do go and they feel misunderstood, they can disengage. Sometimes, the stigma within the communities themselves, so that people may feel, they have to hide the fact that they've got mental health problems, and also, they may be told that depression, for example, is a sign of low faith. So that's another way in which it can feed the cycle of depression. So there are a whole range of issues, both within communities, within institutions, and at the policy level. We don't really have much support for actually changing the way things are. There's a lot of rhetoric and not much investment in this area.
Sure. And Dr. Tina, you've got first-hand experience, obviously, as a practitioner, also working directly with various people from South Asian communities. And what are your observations as being some of the biggest issues that you feel that South Asian communities face in the UK in regards to their mental health?
Yeah, I'd echo everything Dr. Ghazala has said. That there are so many barriers, including our own sense of stigma that we have that's held in the community. So, again, to echo the idea that, we are weak, there will bring shame to the family. And because nobody really talks about mental health in the community, it's seen as something that, you can't bring to the forefront. It has to be something that is hidden. And this is what, you hear about all the time from clients that have, previously worked with. So all of this does impact people. The shame element, I think, is probably one of the biggest elements.
Absolutely. And why do you think there is such a big discrepancy in the number of people from South Asian communities that are accessing mental health services in relation to their white counterparts?
So again, very similar to what Dr. Ghazala said, that there is lack of representation within the workforces. I think that's a huge thing, that when you don't see people who look like you working in the spaces that you want to seek treatment for, that feels one huge barrier. And then obviously there is the systemic racism that occurs within these spaces. And again, walking into a clinic room to talk about your psychological issues is something I think culturally we find very alien. We've come from cultures and communities where it is about, sharing within our own community, or it's done in a way that isn't so direct. Our language is different. The way that we express and the way that we construe what mental health means is very different. So it's not relatable. We use the word anxiety and depression, and I know that within our own languages, there isn't direct translations that occur. So when we go and talk to our doctors about pains and aches, that's where we're talking about. That's the level that we're at. That, often, South Asian people, especially whose language isn't English, will often talk about feelings or psychosomatic symptoms, which then often become misdiagnosed, for example. So there's so many barriers, including our own conception of what mental health is, but then to add on that, the additional stresses from, the shame and the stigma aspect within the community as well.
John, Omar, if I can bring you in, I mean, as a British Muslim Pakistani young person growing up obviously in London in the UK, what has your experience been like in terms of how you've managed your anxiety and depression and really kind of look to help, to look to support services and even to some extent the profession and the areas that you've worked in as somebody passionate around mental health and faith-sensitive mental health approaches? What has that experience been like for you?
Well, I think it's getting much better than it was like even 10 years ago for people. I think that we're so much more open talking about it on various different, whether it be social media or with friends. For me personally, it's been easier because I have such a strong kind of support network, mainly friends. And I say friends because they're from the same generation as me. But when it gets to like parents, obviously there is that generation gap. And I believe that for a lot of people in my age bracket and just a lot of young people, young Muslims in general, they would say the same thing. If I have a conversation with them about their mental health, they're not able to really, open up. It's very sad because it's not like they can go to the mosque and kind of open up to religious people or leaders or kind of teachers or madarises and things like that. So it's very much contained. I think the advice you can seek is quite limited to certain people that you can really trust with these issues. And I think as a whole, obviously the Muslim community, we're getting better at it, but we're still not there where it's really kind of transparent and you're able to like fully kind of express how you're feeling. So I think, I think for me, it's about having that strong support network. Definitely that's helped me. Yeah.
Sure, and Dr. Tina, I mean, in terms of some of the people that you've certainly provided therapy to and seen those support provisions, is that something that kind of echoes with a lot of the people that you speak to around looking at a close a support provisions around their kind of peer network and friends and families in a more informal way? Does that speak to some of the experiences that you're seeing?
Absolutely, 100%. And I've seen a huge shift within the landscape of conversation around mental health. I've been around for about 15 years within the mental health field. And, back in 2005, when I first emerged as a fresh, psychology graduate, the conversation around mental health was like nothing, especially within our communities. And now I'm seeing, 20-year-olds, 18-year-olds, this next generation are hugely inspiring because they are paving the way to teach us how they want to see the world that they want to live in. We are learning from them. And I think that it's about time that, people who've kind of are older, who've lived experience, shares and learns from the young people's ideas around conversations around mental health. They're so much braver. And, growing up in the 80s and 90s, I didn't have a language for the things that I went through when I was a teenager. And this echoes across a lot of millennials as well and older generations. So I think that, with social media and the conversations that happen across social media is a huge positive. And we can only just learn from, the younger generations who are teaching us.
Absolutely. And I think that, social media kind of generation is very much about being self-taught. Of course, there's a flip side to that as well, right? When you're reliant on that kind of source of guidance and kind of encouragement and inspiration, but also it really does serve as a really strong mechanism of support. And certainly undeniably, with minority communities that perhaps don't feel that they've got that space or that trust or that connectivity or relatability in some of the more formal services, I mean, Dr. Ghazala, how does perhaps some of these nuances and some of these areas that I feel that especially the younger generation, when turning to social media and I guess using tech platforms, etc., how does, I guess, a lot of that information around the current experiences and the knowledge around mental health issues and experiences, how does that kind of inform the discourse in academia that you're seeing and that you're leading on to your research?
So I suppose you could sort of link it to the ideas of health literacy and health promotion. And I think there's been underinvestment in minority ethnic communities in terms of improving health literacy and health promotion. So we've seen a lot in the majority community to try to dispel this stigma around mental health issues. We've seen, celebrities being involved in campaigns to be role models, to come out and, be more open about mental health and the issues that people can face, and to say that, they themselves have experienced that. We need more of that within our own communities. We need people from minority ethnic communities to be coming forward, to say, we've also experienced these are the kind of issues around shame and stigma that, Tina and Umra were talking about. Can be challenged and to encourage openness. And I think it's really important for some of that work to be seen as policy-led work, that it's what we've seen, it's similar to COVID. We found a lot of these initiatives to dispel stigma and to dispel misinformation within the communities, Muslim communities, was led by people within the community themselves rather than at a policy level. And that's really not good enough. This should be something where we find policy investment and policy leadership. The leadership is coming from within our communities, and it's not really being supported by policy leaders and people who can put investment into these kinds of areas. So I think, as with COVID, there wasn't leadership in terms of challenging the issues that minority communities were facing. And I think we've got the same thing here. There should be campaigns within communities, to make this a more open issue, to promote health and to promote health literacy. We shouldn't be putting the responsibility on the community. And this is often what happens in health inequalities. The communities themselves are held responsible as though they're to blame for the issues, where actually we haven't had that investment that has happened within the majority community.
Sure. And Umra, I mean, you've obviously worked in charities and organizations as an activist. When we look at, I guess, not just, raising awareness of these issues and looking at things on an advocacy level, but also looking at it in terms of informing policy. I mean, how much does that really speak to some of the campaigns that you've led and you worked on in your own experience?
I mean, broadly speaking, generally from my experience, it is the fact. The fact is that communities are kind of dealing with it by themselves. And what I mean by that is that the third sector and the charity sector have had to really step up. So, for example, faith-sensitive Muslim charities, there's a lot of them springing about, and they're kind of taking on the burden almost of the community, because being part of one of those organizations, I could really see that there's such a need for a service that deals with faith-sensitive mental health, but it's not there, and it's not national, and it's not available to everyone. So I think that I definitely echo what Dr. Ghazala has said about the communities taking on all of the kind of work. And from a policy lens, I haven't really seen much engagement. There is obviously some projects going on, but it's just not enough. So yeah, definitely more needs to be done. Yeah.
I think there's a lot of learning in that, for us all, because even though, we're all advocates and kind of activists in our own right, through whatever profession and sectors that we work in, I think, for us to stay quite close to the communities and grassroots in terms of what we represent, and certainly the voices that we want to try and amplify, there is, as you said, a huge responsibility and obligation on us to ensure that that's kind of, replicated and furthered and across various different channels. And that onus is on us in many ways. So yes, we are trying to use use the power of social media. Yes, we are trying to be part of various different campaigns to inform research, to inform policy in these various different areas. But, how much of that really is seeking the change that we want to see? And Dr. Tina, I know that you talked about this in one of your podcasts, and that sense of empowerment and seeking change, and actually that being evident in the work that you're doing, and certainly in what you're seeing, across the different sectors. And so could you perhaps tell us more about your kind of observations, and certainly speaking to various other guests through your own podcast and their experiences of how that really has been an enabler in many ways?
Yeah, I mean, when I started to talk about South Asian mental health, especially on social media, so many people sprung up and wanted to talk about it, wanted to get involved. And I think that there is definitely a passionate cry for help to get things moving, but that slowly dwindles out because we don't have the support, we don't have the resources to keep going. And we have so many creative agencies coming out, trying to think about ways in which they can support their communities through the very limited resources that they have within their own spaces, to try and help in some way. And funding is a big thing. But then on top of that, we need specialist support as well, therapists, psychologists, psychiatrists, you name it. It has to be a holistic healthcare provision. It can't just be one-sided, purely mental health, because we know that healthcare is a kind of a whole body thing, that our bodies, our minds, and even our social systems impact the way that we experience the world. And I guess, this is something that is a very complex issue, but we need to start to have more integrated conversations. And I think that's one thing that is hugely lacking, that there are lots of little organizations working in silos, but we're not coming together, we're not meeting, and we're not all, looking at all our resources and trying to put them together to try and create something that is big, that is challenging, and that will potentially disrupt the way that, our communities see and experience the current healthcare system, because it's not good enough at the moment.
Sure. And I think, with the collaborative, that's certainly one of the challenges that we face, in that, there are various different services, being operated across, and expertise across the country, and on different scales and different levels, lots of individuals to, perhaps medium to large scale organizations. And of course, there's the statutory services and public health, etc. And kind of really being able to speak to various different types of, organizations and different sectors and different sizes and different kind of capacity around how we can certainly form this, collaborative, or this partnership of wanting to kind of see through this vision of creating more, equity, faith equity and racial equity in these services is a real struggle. I mean, what advice would you all, if I could ask you all really, would you give to services that are wanting to create more of that inclusivity and diversity, and wanting to work across different platforms and different sectors, really, to reach out to those very small grassroots community localized groups and organizations that are just as powerful and just as valuable in many ways, and really understanding the needs on the ground, but also in terms of the experiences and insights that brings? If perhaps Dr. Ghazala, if I could start with you.
Yeah, I suppose it's really taking the same approach as you would in any area of health. If you want to be most effective, you've got to start being more inclusive. You've got to start listening to people who are at the sharp end of the experiences that we're talking about. So in any area of health, there's a very strong principle now that you include people who are service users, who are using services, or who are in need of services. And I think the way Dr. Tina talked about disrupting the stigma within communities, but I think we really need to disrupt NHS routine systems at the moment. They really need a huge overhaul so that they become more inclusive of people from these communities, both in terms of how to develop services further, listening to people with mental health issues from the communities that we're talking about. What issues are they facing? How can they be addressed? Co-producing new ways of doing things. And I think, in terms of the leadership, what I've found throughout my work in this area, and really in terms of work on ethnic health inequities generally, is that the leadership comes from people who understand the issues and, have some personal kind of understanding of it too. So actually making staff within services more representative of the communities that they're serving. If you've got, a significant minority ethnic community in an area, it's really important that the staff are reflective of that, that they can engage effectively with those, and, and also that the training. So with the approach that we developed, we found that even people who are from Muslim backgrounds didn't feel confident to engage on the area of faith because their training didn't really address that at all. So they were just as taking the same wide spectrum of, you deal with that at home, we'll deal with other things in the clinical setting. And it's really important that people get effective training. It's really important that services, look at development, including people in terms of how they develop and the decision-making processes. And that can be through staff representation, but also through engaging with people who use the services.
Sure. And Dr. Tina?
Yeah, I was going to say the same thing. Listen, in a nutshell, you need to listen to the people who are on the ground, who are A, looking for that support, and B, who are going to be doing that work. If we don't listen, we will never learn. And it really has to be, again, to echo what Dr. Ghazala is saying, is co-creation. There's the saying, isn't it? Give a man a fish and he will feed himself for a day. But if you give a man a net, he will feed his family for the rest of, as long as that net keeps going. So we need to be thinking about ways in which our services or any offerings that we co-create are regenerative, that kind of give back and are sustainable and long-term, not just, a short-lived 3-year funding. This has to be long-term. It has to be an investment for the next generation down and beyond, because what I often see is that there's a lump sum of money, it gets spent, and then everything then goes quiet, and the cycle goes on again. This needs to be something that has to be a long-term vision for sure.
Thank you. And Umrah?
Yeah, so I'm just going to basically echoing what the speakers have already said. It's basically just down to, removing that bureaucracy really from, like as Dr. Ghazala said, the NHS routine systems, because they're just so not inclusive, and they really, really put off ethnic minorities from even engaging in the first place. I know from firsthand experience from friends and family that they would rather just keep it to themselves than go to a GP and express their mental health needs. So it's really sad. And obviously service user engagement, getting that lived experience, having those conversations about longevity, and really just thinking about where is the funding coming from, how much do we have, and how can we pull it together to really create something sustainable. So yeah.
Sure. I mean, we've touched on also various different kind of interventions, and we've looked at, how the institutional, ways to kind of reform and look at how we can improve mental health services, but also through creative agencies and change in that way through third sector and communities. And an area that I think, we often talk about a lot, especially, with South Asian communities, is, the more kind of traditional frameworks around relying on families and parents. And something I wanted to bring up here as well, we talked about stigma earlier, etc. But it would be quite interesting to sort of see how much that may have changed or may not have changed with all of these other kind of avenues and platforms and other vehicles of being able to really express one another and seek that help and support. And Umrah, if I could perhaps ask you, as somebody, obviously you come from a large family, I think you're one of 5 siblings, what has that experience been like for you in terms of, again, looking at the right support mechanisms and coping mechanisms, but also doing that whilst knowing that you've got other family members that are also struggling from their own mental health disorders, and of course the lifestyles that we live in, and all the various different challenges that we have, even coming out of the pandemic, really, in terms of financial security and various other things. How has the family, unit, or the family unit been as a source of, if at all, of support, or perhaps not so as much, because of course you spend a lot of time now, indoors during the pandemic, usually with those that we're closest to in our little bubbles, to now having to, reconstruct everything and come out of this pandemic in a way that you're expected, I think, to operate and live according to the way things used to be, but of course don't necessarily feel that way. What has your kind of experience been like?
I think overall it's very difficult, in all honesty, because being second oldest, there are certain duties that are kind of put upon you. Obviously, being South Asian, the culture is very much integrated with your Islamic identity, and you kind of just become a quasi kind of mother figure to your other siblings. So yeah, it's been a challenge because you have to put yourself first and your own kind of needs and mental health kind of issues. But I think that just even having immediate family close by is very helpful, rather than having no one, because I think isolation is kind of worse off for your mental health. So I think that's been helpful to have family. But I think that there are definite pressures that come with having a large family, and certain demands and certain responsibilities that exacerbate your mental health issues, and they have done for me. So yeah, I would just say that it's something that I'm still trying to work out and kind of heal from and put my best foot forward. Yeah.
Sure, and I can appreciate, I guess that kind of parenting role that, many, I guess, siblings sometimes have to play in being that kind of source of kind of inspiration and really support in many ways when there aren't other structures in places and other adequate pathways to support is another real pressure. And Dr. Tina, you must be seeing a lot of that as well, in terms of obviously how not just South Asian families, I mean, of course, lots of people, in terms of the pandemic and really what that has brought to light in many ways in terms of the functionality and how people have coped and managed. And what's your kind of observations been now that we're merging out of this pandemic, and the kind of sources of I guess support and reliance that some of your own clients really have?
Yeah, so we've seen a wide mixture that for many people, being sort of cooped up at home with family, depending on what age you are and what point you are in your life, has been a struggle, especially the younger generation. If they had been living away and they've suddenly had to come back, that was quite a difficult experience, because again, we often talk about young people experiencing duality, or these two identities, their kind of identity that they live beyond the house and the identity that they have within the household, and in particular for girls. And that obviously had been a struggle for many young women that I was working with. As we are emerging, I think that what the pandemic has forced us to reflect on what we have, what we are grateful for, but also what we would like to have in the future. So for many South Asian people, I've seen people really think about what's important to them and why. And this can range from, reevaluating their career choices, reevaluating relationships, and really thinking hard about, any losses that they might have experienced, which obviously for many of us, we've all had some level of loss in some shape or form over the 2 years that we've had this pandemic, but also emerging with a sense that, there can be change and there can be things that we can do. But then there is obviously a portion of us that will go to business as usual as well. So, we'll just kind of emerge as normal and keep going as we have done. I'm hoping for, the first option, which is people reflect and reevaluate what they've been through, make some changes, become empowered, because over this past 2 years, we saw so much happening within the media, within, things happening over in the US and across the world. And being cooped up at home, we were forced to see things and experience things. And in a way, I hope that it's helped us to see the world for what it is and to see that we can make some changes. It's down to us as a collective to make that happen, for our own well-being and for the future generations.
Sure. And Dr. Ghazala, did you want to add anything here?
Yeah, I could just add a couple of things about the whole issue around expectations that may be held within the Muslim community and within different cultural groups about family members and their roles. I think what we found in the research that we did is often those expectations can be very imbalanced. So whereas Islamic teachings will balance those expectations of responsibilities along with rights, often within families, it's the most powerful family members who promote certain expectations at the expense of others. So the rights of the parents, the rights of the husband will be promoted over the rights of the child and the rights of the women. And whereas in Islamic teachings, you do have a balance of those issues, what we often find is that balance is missing in terms of how families operate. So sometimes people need support to, within the same framework, challenge what is going on, what can be unhelpful or even oppressive family dynamics, not going necessarily outside of the Islamic values that families hold, but using within that same framework other teachings that can challenge the dynamics within families. And people sometimes need support to do that. So if you're at the sort of end of feeling, that you're being sort of overburdened or oppressed by the kind of expectations, it's very difficult sometimes without that kind of support to be able to speak up against it. So this is where the approach that we've sort of promoted can be quite helpful, where therapists can liaise with people from the Muslim community in religious authority positions, support people to access that kind of, advice and support, so that often there's a lot of actually religious, lack of religious literacy often within communities where people feel they've got no choice. They can't challenge anything their parents do, for example. But actually, that's not the case. Islam is much more balanced than that, but people do need the support to be able to do that. And I think in terms of the wider society, we have to remember that families within minority ethnic communities are actually subjected to a lot more stresses than people within the majority population. They have reduced capacity. The networks within those communities have deprived resources. So actually what we're expecting of families can't be the same as what we expect. And, it's not the same as a middle-class white family. They don't have the same resources as middle-class white families to be able to offer the same amount of support. So I think we need to really empower communities in order to empower families to give that support. And the idea of empowerment can't be limited to coming from within communities. For power to shift, we have to actually give power from the society as a whole. That has to be shifted more broadly to remove some of those stresses, to increase capacity, to improve what's available within resource networks. And I think that comes back to what we were talking about earlier about people having more ability to make decisions, more opportunities for employment. So this goes beyond really mental health services, but we could make a start there to begin with. If we're really keen to and serious about empowering communities, we should start with the services that we're talking about and make them most representative. And the NHS is a microcosm of society, the biggest employer in the UK. If the NHS and other public services became representative, it would make a huge difference to the lives of people from minority communities.
Absolutely. And Dr. Tina, did you want to add anything?
What's been said. And I think that, when we start to see our faces in front of us doing jobs that inspire us, can you imagine what that does for young people? I mean, I grew up, in the 80s and 90s, didn't know a single brown person that was doing the job that I did. And it was one moment where I watched a TV program where I saw the psychiatrist Raj Persaud talk about depression. And that was my first moment, my first glimpse of somebody who represented an area, a community that looked like me and talk about the things that I pondered about, but I didn't have the language or words. And fast forward, 20 odd years, and so much has changed. But it's not changed quick enough or fast enough. And I think that we need more people, more conversations, but also we need things to be done now. I think that, it's been 15 years I've been kind of having the same conversations, especially when I worked in the NHS. We had the Delivering Race Equality report back, 15 years ago. And then it was, 10 years ago, 10 years after, the same thing was repeated again. But what's different? Not much has actually changed. We need to see action now. I think I'm tired of more and more research and more conversations. It has to be, something needs to be done about it now.
Just in defense of research, I would just say that research design can be really important if you actually support service development through research, and you put in place people who can make a difference in practice. That can be huge. It can have a huge impact. So research is not necessarily ivory tower research. It can be on the ground, actually investing in service development and evaluating that service development. So although I agree with you that knowledge on its own is not enough, research can have an impact in the way it's designed, I think.
No, absolutely.
Yeah, I mean, you've touched on some really important points. I mean, you know, what would you really like to see in terms of, you know, you talked about the fact that we've had, you know, we've got research, we've got some areas that we can certainly hold as kind of being, I guess, evidence-led for this need to create this kind of, I guess, diversity and kind of inclusivity, but, and certainly around seeing more of those familiar, you know, brown or Asian faces. But, you know, what would you like to really sort of, what advice or suggestions would you give for those who do feel empowered, who do want to be more involved and across different sectors and professions in really being able to kind of uphold some of those, I guess, those kind of visions in many ways? What kind of advice or suggestions would you give them?
It has to be top down, of course, but also bottom led as well. So we need conversations or leaders or, you know, prominent influencers from the top to meet with the people who are on the ground. We need the people on the ground to speak up and say exactly what they want and they need. And they might not know, and that's often the case because, you know, we're going into territories which again feels quite alien to us. We don't have the language, we don't have the, you know, training in psychology and mental health, because these are all Western concepts. We need to be able to talk about our own struggles in our own way, in our own words. And I know there's a raft of wisdom within the Islamic teachings around mental health. Why are we not seeing this? Why are we not being taught this? Why is this not within, you know, for example, clinical psychology training? I feel like there are so many gaps in terms of training, but also gaps in terms of our blindness, in terms of choosing to engage in this literature. You know, if we want to be inclusive, let's kind of find out what people really need, but also to look at what's already been done as well, because surely we can learn from other countries as well. And not be afraid to try something that's innovative and not stick within, you know, certain lines of remit, because I think there is a lot of red tape around the way things should be done. And we should be no longer afraid to try things that may feel, you know, a little bit out of scope, because again, it's about trying to meet people where they are, not trying to force people to bring them to where we think they should be.
Sure, and I think, you know, a real driving force for this change is like what you said earlier around the power of a collective in many ways, because there are certainly so many different expertise and insights and experiences that can certainly lend to that. And like you said, you know, sharing that learning, that resource, that understanding, that experience is really valuable, and certainly does kind of enable some of that authenticity to come through also. You know, we're coming towards the end of this podcast, so I'd like to kind of give the opportunity really to our speakers to ask questions to one another. If anyone would like to ask anything, Murat, you might have some questions for our speakers.
I guess one thing that came up for me, was around, you know, Ghazala, you spoke about the idea of how within, you know, Muslim communities, and also I see this across most South Asian communities, of how we have this, you know, kind of dominant and oppressive structures that occur, whereas it's almost in contrast to the teachings of our religions, which talk about equality. How do you feel this has occurred? Because for me, this is a huge gap and a huge potential teaching element that we could actually bring in.
So I think it happens within communities, it happens within wider society. There is competition between different groups of people. If you look at minority ethnic communities, the majority ethnic community, a lot of the time, its resources, people are trying to control resources. And that's where the competition for resources is what leads to some communities being disempowered, and those with least capacity being disempowered. And we see the same within families and communities where the strongest people use their strength to actually, or can use their strength to actually disempower other people. So often it's about keeping control, unfair processes being used to keep others in control and to keep a dominant position. So we do need to think about issues of power and how to redistribute power so that it's actually more beneficial for everybody. And in the long run, actually inequities are not sustainable. You're not making the best use of the resources around. You're actually stopping people from contributing to society, contributing to the family. If somebody in a family, as Umra was mentioning earlier, is under so much expectation that they actually collapse under the weight of that burden, actually their productivity has gone to nothing. So it's not sustainable to have those kind of dynamics, whether we're talking about families, communities, or societies, or nations. Globally, we can sort of think about the contribution of low and middle income countries and how that's ignored and how they're exploited. So these are sort of high level kind of issues to do with power and how stereotypes and different dynamics are used to control resources and to stop people from sharing, from actually sharing in that power. I think this is something that's always going to be with us, but we have to challenge it. If we sort it out in one generation, there will still be the seeds of it for the next, and it's a constant effort to keep justice and fairness and and social harmony. I think that's the test that we're given in this life, isn't it? As Muslims, that's how we'd understand it, that this is the kind of lifelong test that we're going to be having. But each individual one of us, can promote, the kind of principles and way of living that actually would challenge that oppressive practice.
Thank you. Umra, sorry, I might have, did you want to come in there?
Yeah, no, it's all very, very interesting. I was just thinking about how different institutions all play their part. So even, for example, schools and universities, and my sister goes to a very white middle class school in a white area, and I see the clashes already from this age that kind of create that inferiority complex in young people that I also went through. So it's a challenge in every single way. And it is a challenge that's going to be very kind of long-winded, and it's not going to go away very quickly. So I think we do need to come together as a community and just have more of these types of conversations in different social settings and with different people, and engage everyone, young people, old people, parents. That's basically what I was thinking about. Yeah.
Absolutely. I mean, it's incredibly important and obviously valuable in having these conversations, because ultimately it's our perspectives and our experience and certainly all of that we bring through our own profession, where we're able to kind of voice some of those things that otherwise wouldn't get that kind of attention and focus in many ways. And it's also really interesting to see how that is also processed, I guess, through different ways, through lived experiences, which of course we're all, at the end of the day, human, right? But also how that obviously influences and changes our perspectives and our perceptions of things, but also through our profession. And again, that kind of obligation, I think, as part of a community that often isn't represented in the way that it ought to be and should be. It's therefore even more, I guess, of a responsibility on us. But I'd like to thank you all for, of course, being part of this podcast, and for your time and contributions, and obviously wish you all the best with your endeavours, and really do hope that as a collective in many ways, and also as a collaborative, what we're trying to do here at Muslim Mind, it's something that we certainly can kind of further in terms of supporting one another in the work that we're doing. doing to try and, of course, bring light and voice to minority communities and our efforts in this sector. So thank you all very much for your time and, of course, joining the Muslim Mind Collaborative.
You have been listening to the Muslim Mind Collaborative podcast. For more information, please visit bcbn.org.uk.